one of the things that I want to do over the course of the next 40 minutes or so is to look at the idea of romance and its relationship to romanticism. I know this has sort of cropped up a bit in seminar discussions already, but the relationship between romance and romanticism can be deceptive, and it sounds like they're almost the same thing. But I'm hoping that over the course of this lecture I'll be able to demonstrate that actually we should be very careful about using those words as though they're interchangeable, because there are kind of problems with that. But to start off with the Romantic Gothic and just give a very brief kind of summary of it. The Romantic Gothic emerges in the late 18th century, and one of these archetypal examples of late 18th century Gothic is Anne Radcliffe's novels, The Mysteries of Udolpho, which was referred to in that film clip that I played, and also novels like The Italian. There's a sort of recipe to these kinds of novels, and in fact, parodists of the time sort of wrote examples of a recipe for a Gothic novel, and the kinds of things that you would throw in, and monks crop up very often. A heroine who's in peril, some sort of sinister paternal figure, a father or uncle, or someone who has that sort of role of a sort of oppressive, demonic kind of patriarchal figure. And this sort of virginal heroine, often with names like Blanche, signifying a kind of their innocence, their blankness, and so forth. Radcliffe wasn't the first author of the Gothic. He's generally speaking traced back to Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, set in the medieval period, as very often these things were, set in a southern European, specifically Catholic kind of context, as again these things often were. So the sort of exoticism and indeed eroticism, which is apparent in that film clip, are sort of distanced by both history and geographical remoteness. So one of the things that was significant about the 18th century Gothic was the way in which it seemed to give license to a kind of erotic sort of writing that was very popular with young women. And hence there was a degree of concern about them, that there was something about this writing which was sort of improper and a bit lascivious. So it often involves, nocturnal happenings, sort of mysterious intrusions on bedchambers and this kind of thing. The other book that was referred to in that clip was Matthew Lewis's The Monk. And this is a different kind of Gothic novel than the sorts of things that Radcliffe wrote. You have a sinister male figure in it again. You have persecuted female victims and so forth as well. But I suppose you might say that whereas Anne Radcliffe's novels perhaps explore the sort of erotics of masochism, of sort of victimhood and so forth, Matthew Lewis's The Monk is the sort of the counterpart to that. It tends to sort of derive its kicks from sadism, really, sadistic portrayals of sexuality, violence, and so forth. It's great stuff. Anyway, these have often been classified in gendered terms by 20th century critics, particularly so from the feminist explorations of Gothic from the 1970s onwards, often spoke of the idea of a female Gothic and its sort of counterpart in the male Gothic, of which Radcliffe and Lewis would be the sort of archetypal examples. And this has also been classified in generic terms in relation to the idea of Radcliffe's sort of Gothic being the literature of terror, and Lewis's the literature of horror. And I think that sort of maps onto those ideas of a sort of a masochistic frisson of being terrified, and the sort of sadistic kind of idea of horror, of sort of contemplating the spectacle of someone else's suffering. So I suppose the point to take from all of this is that in relation to the late 18th century and early 19th century, when the Gothic genre first really rose to prominence, which is the Romantic period, Gothic is already sort of marked out in very obviously gendered terms. It's the stock roles that are performed by characters are typically gendered. The whole thing is shot through with a kind of sexual frisson. and so forth. And in terms of not just characters and authors, but also in terms of readership, there was an explicit discussion of the significance of reading Gothic fiction, particularly on the morals of young women. So young women were deemed to be at risk from reading Gothic fiction. And in a sense, that's the whole kind of thing, that the joke that underpins Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey is the idea that a series of perfectly straightforward, normal, everyday events and circumstances are misread by the chief protagonist of the novel as kind of things which are invested with sort of Gothic, sinister and indeed erotic connotations. So when we get to Jane Austen writing, around about the same period as the Gothic novel, Northanger Abbey was written in 1799 or thereabouts, there is a sense that the Gothic novel is kind of trashy. It's something which not only is potentially corrupting to morals, but I think, and more seriously from Austen's point of view, it's bad writing, it's bad art, if it's art at all. It's formulaic, it's sensationalist, it doesn't really go anywhere in terms of telling us about character or social values or self-development. It's the same kinds of characters in the same kinds of situations pretty much every time. It's kind of formulaic production line, pot boiler kind of stuff. So Austen satirises the Gothic genre in Northanger Abbey, and then obviously she writes novels which espouse a completely different set of values, in Sense and Sensibility, Mansfield Park, Pride and Prejudice, and so on and so forth. Novels which are much more concerned with the dissection of minds, of psychological depth and insight, of exploring the development of character and of social relationships. And Austen, of course, one of the greatest of all English novelists, certainly one of the great influences in 19th century serious literary writing. And I think we could say that by the start of the 19th century, really the Gothic's reputation is in a fairly parlous state. The Gothic is considered to be problematic, literarily of relatively low status, and so forth. Of course, it's not as though that meant that the Gothic completely went away. It's not as though, from Austen until Robert Louis Stevenson publishes The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or wherever we want to sort of pin the late 19th century Gothic vogue as beginning. But it's not as though the Gothic went away. The Brontes write very much in a Gothic mode in Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights and The Attempt at Wildfell Hall, with these Byronic heroes full of passionate, tempestuous relationships, figures like Rochester and Jane very much playing out the sort of Gothic archetypes of an oppressive patriarchal figure and a woman who's lacking a mother figure, who's exposed to danger and sort of the risk of some sort of sexual violation potentially. So a lot of those Gothic tropes are clearly present in the writing of the Brontes and persist, although that may be to some extent a function of the fact that the Brontes were very much outside of mainstream literary society and literary culture in their relatively isolated position in Haworth. But the Gothic continued to fascinate, and indeed you can see that there's a strand of romanticism that continues, even though we sort of tend to draw a distinction between the Romantic period and the Victorian period, around about 1830. Both the Gothic remains as a fascination, but also Romanticism as a sort of strand of 19th century culture persists. And one of the perhaps most important figures in the sort of continued significance and influence of both Romanticism and Gothic in the 19th century is the writer and art critic John Ruskin. This is him, obviously. And Ruskin was a great champion of the Gothic. And not for its ostensibly kind of sexy aspect, not for the sexual frisson so much, but because Ruskin saw it as being both more authentic than alternatives, but also he saw it as embodying an idea of truth. And he gives this illustration in his book Modern Painters to illustrate the difference between Gothic and Classicism. And he sets up this opposition, and it's an important one, and I'm going to go on and talk about this a little bit more, because it's not just important for Ruskin, it becomes important for sort of everything that happens afterwards, including right into modernism, right into the 1920s. This distinction between modernism and classicism becomes a really important defining distinction. So what you have here, in these two illustrations here, are from statuary, from stone carving. And the subtitle, if you can't read it, describes them as true and false griffins. And that's an interesting way of looking at them, because clearly a griffin is a mythological creature. So there is no real griffin. This is, in other words, this is not a distinction that's based on realism. This isn't about the true depiction of an actual animal. But rather, it's about the truth to nature. So on the left we have a medieval carved griffin, and this is the Gothic, grotesque kind of griffin. And on the right we have a classical griffin. Roman, I think it is. And when Ruskin compares these things, he says that, in a nutshell, the one on the left is true and the one on the right is false. And the reason for that is that the one on the left looks like the sort of, if there were such a thing as a griffin, if there were such an animal, that's what it would look like. It wouldn't look like the one on the right. The one on the right may be more elegant, it may be, have greater symmetry, but Ruskin talks about the way that its leg extends, the way that its face and its neck join onto its body and so forth, and says, well, the one on the left, the medieval, the Gothic griffin, just looks like that, the way that nature puts things together. It's more true, it's more authentic. So his preference is for the Gothic as something which, even though it's grotesque, feels like it's something which is kind of emerged naturally, organically. Whereas the classical example seems schematic by comparison. And that's a general preference that Ruskin has for Gothic architecture over classical architecture. He describes in his book The Stones of Venice how Gothic architecture is superior to classical architecture, because Gothic architecture, full of imperfections as it is the product of individual craftsmen. It's skilled work. There's both a sort of a mechanical, manual skill involved in it, and also an intellectual skill in designing. Each element of a Gothic building that's been carved has been carved by somebody who designed it as well. Whereas classical architecture was built by slaves, and therefore they're designed to be produced from regularly made pieces. Somebody just needs to be able to make one thing, one particular type of carving, and repeat that design over and over again, and then that can be used to construct buildings in the classical style. In other words, Ruskin is also partly here, not just talking about the ancient world, he's talking about the modern world. His preference for the Gothic over the classical is also a preference for traditional organic society, as you conceive of it, over the modern industrial world, which, like classicism, is based on wage slavery, upon the regularising of output, factory production lines and all that kind of thing, and de-skilling. So the preference that Ruskin has for Romanticism and for the Gothic is also tied into his mainstream social critique of Victorian society and culture. Now, if we fast forward to the 20th century, so Ruskin wrote The Stones of Venice in 1853, I think. If we now leap forward a little over half a century to 1911, a man called T.E. Hume, who died in the First World War, but was one of the great kind of conservative intellectuals of the age, and a major influence on the likes of T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, wrote an essay on Romanticism and Classicism. But he reverses the preference. So whereas Ruskin saw the Gothic and the Romantic as the most important things that were sort of authentic and open to all the sort of limitless possibilities of human creativity, as opposed to that very constrained idea of creativity, that schematic sense of design that you get with classicism, for T. Hume, exactly the opposite is the case. Romanticism is a kind of vapid illusion. So he writes, put shortly, these are the two views then. One, that man is intrinsically good, spoilt by circumstance. and the other that he is intrinsically limited but disciplined by order and tradition to something fairly decent. To the one party, man's nature is like a well, to the other, like a bucket. The view which regards man as a well, a reservoir full of possibilities, I call the romantic. The one which regards him as a very finite and fixed creature, I call the classical. So hopefully you can sort of get the same distinction that Ruskin's making there, this idea of human nature on the one hand as being seen as something which is kind of an infinite well of possibilities, open to sort of endless creative exploration by individuals, and on the other, this sort of classical view that T. Hume identifies with, which regards human nature as like a bucket, a fixed thing that can't be made any bigger. Well, you can draw endless reserves from it. A bucket is just the size that it is, and nothing you can do can enlarge that or make it have any greater possibilities. All you can do is try to discipline it to make it something fairly decent. Now, that's the view of T. Hume, that's the view that prevails in modernism. So what we have, in a sense, is the sort of view of the Gothic as something which is kind of harking back to the medieval, and then we've got this idea of classicism as a sort of rejection of that and an embrace of the modern world, an embrace of industrialisation, but also an embrace of a rather sort of conservative estimation of what human nature is capable of. Now, I said at the start of the lecture that I wanted to tease out the distinctions a little bit between romance and romanticism, and that there was maybe a danger in assuming that the two words were interchangeable. And this speaks very much to the point, because if we take the view of Sir Henry Rider Haggard, which I included this quotation in the last lecture, where at this beginning of Alan Quatermain, the narrator, Alan Quatermain, offers this view of human nature. And what's striking about this is, even though this is one of the sort of great examples of a romance novel, in the Romance Revival, the view that we get of human nature is almost identical to the view of human nature that we get from T.E. Hume, i.e. it's a preference for that sort of view of human nature as limited rather than an endless reservoir of possibilities. So Rider Haggard describes human nature as like an iron ring. So T.E. Hume, it's a bucket. For Rider Haggard, it's an iron ring. Different metaphors, but essentially they're making the same point. You can go round and round it, you can polish it highly, you can even flatten it a little on one side, whereby you will make it bulge out on the other. But you will never, while the world endures and man is man, increase its total circumference. So this is quite significant, because the Romance Revival, and connected to it, the Gothic, doesn't seem to be in itself immediately, obviously, a kind of rehabilitation of Gothic values, of romantic values. In fact, if anything, it seems to be a rejection of them, this notion that human nature is like an iron ring. Likewise, if we think about what Robert Louis Stevenson says in, we haven't read this one, Humble Remonstrance, another one of his essays on the value of the romance genre. He describes life as being monstrous, infinite, illogical, abrupt, and poignant. Now that all sounds like the kinds of things that we would expect of the grotesque, of the Gothic, this idea of monstrosity, infinite possibilities and so forth. But the work of art, which is what's his primary concern in this essay, and included within this, is the work of art as romance. A work of art, in comparison, is neat, finite, self-contained, rational, flowing, and, interestingly, emasculate. So he's defining the work of art in terms which seem to go very much against all those notions of the Gothic, of the grotesque, and so forth, that we find Ruskin valorising and validating, or that we find in the work of the Brontes, or going back further to the Romantic period and the Romantic poets. So, just to try to sort of schematise this a little bit, Romanticism seems to correspond to the Gothic, and the Romantic Gothic, that notion of the grotesque and so forth. Modernism, as sort of anticipated by T.E. Hume, would seem to be on the side of classicism, on order and restraint and discipline and so forth. But the question is, where does romance sit within this? On the one hand, it seems to be about passion. Stevenson in A Gossip on Romance talks about that sense of reading being a sort of voluptuous experience that draws you out of yourself. And that seems, does it not, to kind of lean towards that notion of romance as a sort of infinite well of possibilities. Yet when he talks about actually writing it, he's talking about something which is a much more disciplined activity. Nicholas Daly, in his book on modernism, Romance and the Fin de siècle, tries to make sense of where the Romance revival and late 19th century Gothic sits in relation to the Gothic tradition as a whole and a sort of Romantic Gothic. And he concludes that it doesn't really make too much sense to try to read the late 19th century Gothic as sort of persisting with the themes that we get in the 18th century. Those ideas of the Romantic sublime, for example, of sort of confrontation with huge mountainscapes and seascapes and vast Arctic wastes and the huge immensity of the universe and the world is overwhelming the individual. Those sorts of ideas of the sublime and the picturesque and so forth don't really seem to persist. So he says that these late 19th century Gothic texts like Stevenson's offer us narratives and figures that remain inscrutable when we try to read them through the conventions of the 18th century Gothic of Walpole, Radcliffe and Lewis, but they yield at their meaning when read as components of the imaginary of a modern imperial society, a society increasingly characterised by the ideology of professional expertise and by consumerism. Now, there's quite a lot to unpack there, but to try to simplify it, what he's really saying is that the Romance revival and the Gothic that's associated with it belongs to a different world than the 18th century Gothic. There's a sort of great divide in between them, which he wants to position within the 1880s. And he's not alone in that. The cultural critic Stuart Hall made similar sort of claims, connected particularly to the ideas of imperialism and consumerism, that the world that we have in the 1880s is a world that much more closely resembles our own than it does the world at the start of the 19th century. So the Gothic, the late 19th century Gothic and the Romance revival, to some extent, can be seen as the beginnings of a recognisable modernity that still has a claim on our imagination. It's one of the reasons that Daly claims that we still are fascinated by Dracula and Jekyll and Hyde and all these characters. And it's striking how persistent these particular Gothic characters have been, that they still get remade, new film adaptations coming out. There's something about them that has this claim on our imagination. And Daly argues that it's to do with the way that they are connected to historically specific figures and formations that still are recognisably part of our own world. And he gives some examples of these, what he calls historically determinate figures. The mummy, the team of men, which we get in The Beetle, in Dracula and so forth, and in King Solomon's Mines, Alan Quatermain. That's a recognisable, historically determinate figure of the team of men. The treasure map, they're all historically determinate figures, untranslatable in terms of a Gothic or Romantic lexicon of sublimity, picturesqueness and alienation. So they belong to the late 19th century as something which is a world that's very distinct from that of the late 18th century. Okay. So I want to now look a little bit at some of these examples of late 19th century Gothic to see, in what sense these are historically determinate figures, and in what sense they articulate something about the world that is new, that's specific to its time. One of the most well-known quotations from Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is this one, where Jekyll writes, "Man is not truly one, but truly two. I say true because the state of my own knowledge does not pass beyond that point. Others will follow, others will outstrip me on the same lines, and I hazard the guess that man will be ultimately known for a mere polity of multifarious, incongruous, and independent denizens. Human nature is not singular and unified. in the case of Jekyll's own experience, human nature is twofold. There's him, Henry Jekyll, but there's also Edward Hyde, both occupying the same body, both occupying the same mind in some respects. It's kind of contest or conflict or contradiction between them. But as he says two just because that's been his own experience, but he speculates that actually it's not just two, it could be an almost limitless multiplicity of different characters, personas that inhabit the individual, that we are not in any sense unified, but are made up by all these different personalities, personas that exist simultaneously within us. That's a striking idea, it's a bold idea. It's not a unique idea though. Ideas about the unconscious were circulating widely in the late 19th century. There were people like F.W.H. Myers who speculated that human nature was made up of multiple levels of consciousness, some of which were ancestral, some of which belonged to our sort of prehistoric ancestors and indeed previous stages of evolution. That we were, and Stevenson writes about this elsewhere as well, that to some extent the modern human mind is at some level animated by the sort of ape-like intelligence of an early primate. It's very much the sort of idea that we can see developing in the 20th century in the work of people like Sigmund Freud, but also in terms of the poetics of the modernist novel, the sort of shifting registers of consciousness, the stream of consciousness and so forth. But it also connects with the late 19th century historical context in other ways as well, not just in terms of the aesthetics of literary fiction, but also in terms of models of human personality and more specifically, models of masculinity that are prevailing in the late 19th century. Andrew Smith, in his book Victorian Demons, talks about what he sees as a bifurcated model of masculinity. So, one that divides. One that in its own way constitutes a crisis. It's generated out of a male tradition of writings on degeneracy, sexology and self-help. Such a model of masculinity also appears in a medical context which uses images of disease in order to pathologise the ostensibly respectable middle-class male. So in the late 19th century writings about masculinity, about sexuality, in people like Havelock Ellis writing about sexology, people like Cesare Lombroso talking about the idea of degeneracy, of the criminal as a distinct anthropological type, and so forth, have this, what Smith calls this bifurcated model of masculinity, whereby you have two different kinds of masculinity inhabiting the same space, the same body. Jekyll and Hyde is, of course, the most celebrated example, but by no means the only one. If we think about Oscar Wilde's Picture of Dorian Gray, for example, which we'll be looking at later on the module, you have that same sense of a duality of, on the one hand, a kind of respectable middle-class persona, and on the other hand, this sense of a persona that's dark, that's animalistic, that's primitive, that's sadistic, and so forth, that inhabits the same body, or that's sort of hidden behind a respectable facade. It's not surprising in that sense that when Jack the Ripper began murdering prostitutes in the East End of London in 1888, the language that newspapers used to describe this were directly lifted from Stevenson's story, Jekyll and Hyde, and talked about a real-life Edward Hyde haunting the streets of London. Jekyll and Hyde is only the most obvious of these senses of kind of bifurcated or dual masculinities, though. In the stories that we're looking at on the module, the body snatcher, we have Fetz and Macfarlane, on the one hand with a superficial sense of middle-class respectability, but they are really the kind of counterpart of Burke and Hare, and doing the same filthy work. In the Suicide Club, we've got someone like Prince Florizel, who on the one hand is the pinnacle of respectability as a European nobleman, but on the other hand, clearly has this appetite for seeing the seamier side of life, which is what attracts him in the first place to the Suicide Club. And also in Treasure Island, we've got a character like Long John Silver who oscillates between two different positions, and Jim Hawkins tries to make sense of Long John Silver in terms of whether he can trust him or not. You know, his shifting sense of allegiances, friend or enemy. But also within Jim Hawkins himself, there is this sort of sense of him on the one hand as an innocent boy, but on the other hand someone capable of murder in his own right. Or killing someone anyway. And the Suicide Club, I would suggest, is itself an exploration of the ambivalence of masculinity, these sort of shifting positions that we find that characters occupy. Prince Florizel, I've already mentioned as somebody who, on the one hand, you know, has a respectable public persona, but is also drawn to anything and everything that seems to offer the thrill of excitement and elicit pleasure. We have this more generalised representation of a kind of male bohemian leisured lifestyle of clubs and so forth. We have the young man with the cream tarts who seems to be something of a dilettante, somebody who's in pursuit of pleasure and indeed in pursuit of his own self-destruction. Silas Scudamore and the brother of Geraldine, Florizel's chief officer, they're all young men who on the one hand seem to court self-destruction and on the other hand seem to be in need of some sort of redemption or to be saved. The president of the Suicide Club represents perhaps the kind of counterpart to Prince Florizel. You know, he's a leader, he's a sort of military type figure, but he's also in pursuit of a cause which is absolutely rotten to its core. And then we have someone like Malthus, whose involvement is on a different kind of basis. I don't want to sort of preempt your discussions too much because we'll be talking about this in seminars. But clearly Malthus is a fascinating figure in his, you know, how he stands in relation to the Suicide Club, how he stands in relation to society more generally, and you know, what he might represent in terms of a pathologised masculinity. And then in The Adventure of the Hansom Cabs, the third of the three stories in the Suicide Club, we have this sort of alternative, sort of countervailing force that's set up to combat the Suicide Club. You know, how that relates to the sort of bohemian subculture, to men's sort of, homosocial clubs more generally. What are the moral distinctions? What are the aspects of this that are respectable as opposed to in some way pathologised? So we have on the one hand this sort of idea of the gentleman as a respectable figure, and on the other hand we have this sense of a pathologised masculinity with Malthus, with Edward Hyde, with Burke and Hare, and a sense perhaps in Stevenson's writing that perhaps the aim is to find ways of circumscribing respectable masculinity. Are these novels which explore transgression in order to clamp down more tightly on the repression that's necessary to maintain masculinity as respectable? You know, is the ultimate lesson, is there a lesson from Jekyll and Hyde? Is it ultimately that Jekyll's initial state of repression was the one that he should aspire to? Is that a necessary cost of civilization? What we see in each case with this gentleman is that the pursuit of desire results in something catastrophic. Florizel pursues his desire for sort of bohemian indulgence and voyeurism to a degree, which turns into hell and damnation in the Suicide Club. Jekyll pursues his sensual appetites to the point where they become demonic, obsessional, uncontrollable. Macfarlane and Fetz, to some extent, are animated by professional ambition, but that professional ambition spills over into pitilessness, and their vanity spills over into moral emptiness. So I want to suggest that in terms of what Nicholas Daly talks about with the Romance and the Gothic in the late 19th century, that it makes more sense to think about them not in relation to the Gothic themes of the sublime and so forth that we take from the 18th century, but instead to think about them in terms of what's specific to the late 19th century that makes it, you know, the new modern world. And there are a few things that arise from the work of critics like Andrew Smith. and Barbara J. Black that maybe we want to latch onto and think about as these historically determinate figures, these particular things that maybe help us to make more sense of the appeal and resonance of these texts at the time. So the figure of the degenerates will be one. The significance of the figure of the doctor and of kind of medicalised knowledge will be another. And the third one, in relation to what we'll be looking at this week in Barbara Black's essay, men's private clubs. So this is an image of late Victorian clubland in London. All those little numbered circles with a name by them corresponds to a gentleman's club, a male-only space, all with their particular rules, conventions, memberships, and so forth. It's the heart of the kind of elite centre of London society, and it's dominated by these spaces. What's interesting about clubland, and perhaps one of the reasons why it captures the imagination, is to do with, on the one hand, it being so redolent of elite society, of privilege and social power, on the one hand, but on the other hand, it being a specifically homosocial space, male-only, men-only space, at a time when masculinity is increasingly, according to Andrew Smith, becoming pathologised. Middle-class masculinity is becoming something that perhaps seems to be suspicious, a facade behind which something more dangerous and sinister altogether is lurking. Barbara Black suggests that in the last decades of the 19th century, London's clubland became the arena of urgent and vexing reconstructions of late Victorian masculinity in crisis. A crisis, she says, that was fueled by wider cultural anxieties about gender, sexuality and class. You can pick up this sort of sense of a crisis of masculinity or crisis in masculinity. Is pervasive in the late 19th century and in lots of discussions about it. Whether it's real or imaginary is another question. But there is, a palpable sense of some sort of crisis, of something that's in question or in doubt. Whether it's in Gothic novels which have aristocrats or respectable middle-class doctors as monsters, or whether it's in sort of comic mode, as in this illustration from George and Weedon Grossmith's Diary of a Nobody, in which Charles Pooter is represented as a sort of the archetypal sort of ineffectual middle-class male. Black wants to argue that clubland becomes a sort of a powerful image or metaphor through which to think about this crisis in masculinity, partly because of the way that it is situated within the sort of Romance and Gothic fiction of the period. And she writes that the generic excesses of romance and sensation literature came to indulge in excesses of other sorts, and clubland provided a particularly charged world of secrets, a club imaginary within the urban fantastic that enabled immersions and submersions in desire. So the very secrecy, the very exclusivity of these clubs became itself a kind of figure for the idea of a bifurcated masculinity, of on the one hand a respectable facade and on the other something that's going on within it, which is secret, that may be sinister, perverse, or in some other way pathologized. And she goes on. For many late Victorian male authors, London's clubs promised tales of escape from both domesticity and feminine domestic realism, escape through acts of self-fashioning and identity construction that ensured detachment from bourgeois existence and distance from its obligations and duties. You think about what is it that appeals to Florizel in the first place when he hears about this club that the young man with the cream tarts is going to, this place there where you have to sort of pass beyond a doorway into past a sort of point of no return, almost through the gates of hell. What is drawn to is this sense of it being a kind of escape from respectability, from all the normal rules that apply in middle-class bourgeois existence. For Barbara Black, the basis for this crisis is in the broader developments of the later 19th century, in which include the extension of democratic rights, the campaign for women's emancipation, the increased visibility in terms of media scandals and so forth of male homosexuality, the development of professionalisation, changing careers and so forth, and anxieties about imperialism, of, on the one hand, Britain having the largest empire in the world, and on the other hand, a series of relatively unsuccessful or problematic military campaigns in which it seemed that the male population of Britain were not fit for military service. Andrew Smith, on the other hand, suggests that the crisis can be accounted for by debates at the time concerning the relationship between gender and sex, staged within a tradition of male writing about gender. So for Smith, this is much more to do with things like sexology, degeneration theory, medicalised discourses about the male body and about male sexuality. And that this crisis, interestingly, isn't produced from outside, for example, by advocates for female emancipation and criticisms of male power, but is actually a critique that arises from within the mainstream dominant male culture itself. And as Smith says, and this is the point I want to leave you with, just to think about, as it applies to Stevenson's stories, Smith says of Gothic masculinity that the Gothic participated in a cultural narrative that helped to demonise the male bourgeois profession. So to what extent is the legacy of late Victorian Gothic an image like this one? It's obviously Jack the Ripper or something, but an image of the late Victorian professional gentleman, middle-class male, where that image connotes something which is sinister, demonic, pathologised, dangerous. Okay, I'll leave you with that thought.